Alright, so I'm reading from Minion. I'll probably reverse it if I figure out how. But I'm reading Minion from L.A. Banks. R.I.P. She died a few years ago, but I love this series. So, yeah, let's get into it. After the fall of the Dark Angel, after man and woman were deceived and ousted from paradise, the legions of evil beset humanity with all manner of strife and hardship to sway their choice. Earth became the gray zone of choice, where free will could manifest for good or evil, and a soul could be compromised in this fragile environment that casts shadows of darkness amid the light. The angels on high wept as they watched the fate of humankind struggle against demonic forces, mere flesh and bones, and the hope of earthbound spirits crushed by plagues, pestilence, famines, disasters, violence. No mercy. The cry for help that went up to heaven from the peoples of the earth was heard. From the 12 scattered tribes, 12 guardian councils were mission anointed and made up of honorable, courageous men and women of all positive faiths and all races, working as a united front, quietly moving behind the scenes, each battling evil in their own corner of the globe. The balance could not be easily tipped. Their fight was vigilant. But just as the forces of evil had human helpers to reinforce the negative spheres of soul-killing influence, the forces of good had the guardians, those that held the line no matter what challenges befell them. They would not allow the light to be extinguished. And from those 12 armies came the covenant, one from each guardian council, 12 members in all, the bravest of the brave, the wisest of the wise, the keepers of the faith and the knowledge between worlds. Only the covenant could foretell the coming of the Neteru, although they would never know whether this super being, mortal, would come as male or female. All they could do was to prepare a special Neteru guardian team as they searched for the prophesied infant. Such an assignment is the highest honor bestowed upon a guardian council, whose mighty task was to ensure that the once every 1,000-year visitation of a balanced swaying force of light, a Neteru, would be secreted away from evil until old enough to fight. But first, before they could protect this mortal, they would have to find the baby before evil could destroy it. This time, the light sent the Millennium Neteru. Prologue. 20 years ago, New Orleans. Sarah Richards stood in the middle of her bedroom trying to console her infant, who was wailing at the top of her tiny lungs. Yes, she knew what pain was, and wanted to cry out as much as the baby was carrying on right now. Instead, silent tears slid down the sides of her face as she turned her chin up to the ceiling and shut her eyes. How, Lord, was the preacher's wife supposed to deal with the fact that her husband was having an affair? For months, she denied the obvious, but now her husband's lies regarding his whereabouts had been found out. He'd even violated the sanctity of their home by bringing this woman to their bed, their marital bed. Evidence, in the form of the marriage violator's perfume and blood, still clung to the sheets. She'd only been gone an hour on a church errand her husband had contrived for her to do. 1 hour, and now this? Sarah covered her mouth and turned away, hastening from the sight and stench of the filth taking her baby girl to lay her in her crib. With her hands trembling, she left the screaming infant, whose wails intensified as she turned away from her. Shame burned through her. How could she call the church elders or talk to Mother Stone about something like this? How did a preacher's wife, the first lady of the church, force her lips to say that her husband, the Reverend Richards, had lost his natural black mind? Amid the now hiccuping cries from the nursery, Sarah became very still as she heard movement in the small clapboard house below her. There were two voices, one soft, seductive. The other was that of her husband. He brought this horror back to his home again. Once wasn't enough? Did he think she was so foolish as to run another church errand at night again, so he could get away with doing God knows what? Couldn't he hear his own child screaming her lungs out? And wouldn't he know that his wife was upstairs? Did he have so little respect for her? Or was it that this horse pull was that strong? Tears of bitter rage and hurt stung Sarah's eyes, the pain of her acknowledgement almost crushing her ribcage as the muscles around her heart constricted. This woman, this transgressor, had a hold on her husband that not even the Lord could seem to break. Because Father God knew she'd preyed on it from the first inkling of doubt. Now, her husband had brought a violator back into his house. Her house. A home designed for a minister, his wife, and children, across the street from hallowed ground. Sarah felt her knees begin to buckle as she envisioned the faces of loyal parishioners who hung on the good Reverend's every word, just as she once had. This house was not a home, nor was it a place where she or her child could find peace. She resisted her first instinct, which was to burrow downstairs to confront her husband and the heifer that had crossed her threshold. But something slithered inside Sarah's soul and gave her pause. The green-eyed monster raised its ugly head. She had to know what this hussy looked like. Who was this woman that could break up her hearth and home using something that all women had? She wanted to spy and know the things her husband said to this homewrecker. What lies had Armand Richards told? Silently, like a thief in the night, Sarah Richards crept down the hall, hugging the wall. She knew this house by heart and easily avoided the creaky floorboards. Stretching her body, she clung to the very paint as she peered around the corner of the landing. The baby's cries escalated, her pulse rising along with it. She held her breath as she rounded the corner and froze. A tall, handsome, male figure, the color of cafe au lait, and dressed in an impeccable black suit, ran a palm across her husband's jaw. The caress was sensuality personified. The sight stole the scream from Sarah's lungs as her husband closed his eyes and dropped his head back in a display of sheer feminine submission. Sarah took the stairs one by one, clutching the handrail to keep from passing out. She couldn't breathe as she watched in abject horror while this man, a man, not a woman, embraced her husband like a lover and lowered his head to Armand's exposed neck. When she heard her husband groan, something fragile within her snapped. Everything became a blur. Her feet flew down the stairs. Her screams outstripped her infant daughter's. The world became a chant. God, no, not that. She would crucify this beast, this fowler of her household. There was no rational thought as she hurled herself forward, trying to grab hold of his broad shoulders. She wanted blood, a pound of flesh, but the agile intruder simply swept her husband up in his arms as though he were sweeping away his bride, and deftly slipped through the door with him. Sarah gave chase into the front yard, screaming, crying, hollering behind them, but only the night heard her. She spun in a crazed circle, searching the darkness for them. Where had this lover taken her husband, and so quickly? Sarah fell to her knees in the gravel driveway. The stones cut through her nightgown and pierced her knees. Bloodied, she lay outstretched, sobbing a futile prayer. A man? It was a man. Dear Jesus in heaven, no. A man, gorgeous, with jet black, penetrating eyes, a regal carriage, flawless skin, thick black lashes, onyx curls that would shame any woman. A man. Please no. A man that stood 6'2" with a solid frame and strong enough to lift her husband as if Armand was a baby. No. She heaved and vomited, wiped her mouth, and clawed the dirt until she could push herself upright. She stared up at the sky and then at the lit window of her daughter's room. Sarah walked slowly back to the house and reached for the telephone. The church matriarch should send her daughter Marlene to look after the baby tonight. She heard her inner voice say. Marlene was good with infants. She was a nice young woman. Right now, Sarah Richards had an errand to run, one that she'd put off all these months. She needed something more than prayer. Her husband was with a man, and the church elders didn't know nothing about pain like that. The old lady who lived on the edge of the swamps had potions and such to correct those kinds of abominations, and what Sarah would tell her would stay between her and the old witch. For 3 days, Sarah sat in the living room window as the church elders held the prayer vigil at her home. Young Marlene had brought them with her when Sarah had hysterically called her for a babysitter at that odd hour of the night and had told the girl that her husband was gone. What else had she expected? One didn't call at that hour and think the girl wouldn't have to explain things to a mother, who would then call in church reinforcements, not when there was a problem at the church head's house. But desperation had kept Sarah from thinking things through that far. If they thought he'd just run off, fine. That had been enough for the old folks to mount a prayer posse. Minister was nowhere to be found. His wife and child had been abandoned. Evil was at work. That was all Sarah would say on the matter. She slept in the parlor chair while she struggled with her plan, unable to ever go back to her own bed, unable to even lie down on the couch. She refused to eat, barely took a sip of water, didn't move, just stared. Who knew what other piece of furniture had been violated within her home? Each day that passed, the black bag she'd hidden in the pantry issued a more urgent call for her to take matters into her own hands. Yet, to do so would be a death of all she'd been brought up to believe in. It would be flying directly in the face of the Lord. 3 days and 3 long nights, Sarah pondered the seductive choice. She quietly thanked the praying people that had descended upon her house, never saying so out loud, just in her mind. Their eyes remained lowered, and she appreciated their discretion. She said a prayer of thanks that young Marlene Stone was taking such good care of her child while her nerves took leave. Sarah Richards knew that she had checked out of life. Her eyes simply watched the point of nothing beyond the window. But in this third night, she also knew what she had to do. The elders, for all their prayers, didn't know where her husband's car had disappeared to, or where the good reverend was for that matter. But the old seer had spoken of a mansion, a plantation, had given her directions and landmarks to follow, and she would arm herself with her spell and a butcher knife to right this wrong as soon as the sun set. just as the witch had advised. Without a word, Sarah stood and feigned illness, leaving the prayer warriors who had murmured without relent since the night she'd seen too much. Sarah went to the bathroom and splashed water on her face, and then snuck into the pantry to collect her bag that had been secretly readied. In her bare feet and robe, she slipped from the house and into the night without a sound. She was going to fetch back her husband or die trying.